Hello and welcome back to another video, and today we're going to talk about music in the context of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. This is one of the most widely discussed subjects in the field. As many of you are aware, there are published playlists for use in psychedelic sessions, and many providers create their own playlists. And there's a lot of thought gone into that, and there's been quite a bit of research into that as well. Playlists are often designed to create the arc of the experience, or at least resonate with or mimic the arc of the subjective experience that the client is having with the onset of the medicine, the intense peak of the medicine experience, and the sort of resolution of the experience coming back into a sober state and integration. So a lot of you watching this probably have a lot of opinions about that and personal experiences with music one way or the other. It's very powerful and can really shape the subjective experience. You will hear a lot of participants describe how when a certain song came on, the scene shifted, so to speak, or the content of what they experienced shifted. So let's talk today about the potential power of that tool, and also some caveats that I'm going to emphasize that I don't think we hear often enough. Spoiler alert is that I think that we overuse music in the context of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, and that there are some downsides to using it. So let's break that down a little bit. Those of you who have been watching this series know that I differentiate between someone who is sitting with a person, a guide or a sitter, especially in an underground context, who's holding space and just making sure someone is safe during an experience on a psychedelic, and a therapist. So if you are a guide or a sitter, if that is your appropriate role, then music makes a lot of sense in that context, and you want to be mindful about the music. But that conversation is outside the scope of this talk today. However, if you are a therapist and you are working with a client mutually agreed upon as a psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy experience, then the understanding is that you're going to be doing psychotherapy while they're in the altered state. You are going to be having a conversational back and forth, and you're going to be attempting to prompt the client around agreed upon topics that they're struggling with and that they want to work on with the psychedelic medicine. By definition, most clients are doing this work because there's an area of symptoms or content that they're struggling with that they haven't been able to resolve in other styles of therapy. And they're hoping that being in an altered state on a psychedelic medicine will enable them to work through that material or content more easily with the assistance of the therapist. So at this point, I think those of you who've been watching this series understand that I feel that psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is an active intervention, an active therapy intervention with conversation. So in that context, what is the role for music? The first thing to appreciate is that, as I spoke to earlier, music can shape the subjective experience of the client quite powerfully. We are particularly tuned into musical cues, the emotional cues of music when we're in an altered state. We tend to focus on it in a way and absorb it in a way that we may not even in the sober state. And so changing the tone of music, a certain tone of music to another tone, can shift what the person is experiencing visually or emotionally or internally in other ways. So as you can imagine, this can be used to great benefit. But be aware that if you are using music in a therapy session, the music is going to shape the experience to a degree that it may take the person away from working on the content that the two of you have agreed that you want to work on. So I do not recommend using preset playlists, and I don't recommend using music arbitrarily or spending the bulk of the session with a client listening to music. I think that there are targeted ways to use music, and so let's talk a little bit about what those are. Typically, I think the bulk of the minutes of a session, and this applies to any psychedelic medicine, but for purposes of this conversation, I'm going to assume you're using ketamine because of its it's legal use and practice for most of you right now. So we're talking about a 40-minute session or so. The bulk of those minutes should be spent in conversational check-in, though slow and appropriate, not constant back and forth. And I think you've already seen my videos on that element of conversational style. This should be spent on checking in with a person's subjective experience and allowing them to communicate that to you and know that they've been heard, and then some prompting. So in order to do that, you need to not have music playing that's very going to be very evocative for the person to go off in a different direction. So I recommend that the bulk of your session be spent without music in the conversation. Times to use music. Number one is if a particular piece of music is relevant or resonant with what they're working on, then using your own clinical judgment and your own intuitive abilities here, you can bring that in. I've seen that done very successfully. An example of that would be, say a client has arrived at a place where they are reporting a sense of universal compassion or self-compassion, maybe being a sense of being in the presence of an energy or an other that's very compassionate, and starting to feel this compassion or forgiveness for themselves that they have never been able to feel before. In that place, you may choose, instead of talking about that, right, which is a little bit more like bringing them to the cognitive, may actually take them out of that awareness. You may actually prompt them to lean in and just notice that feeling more. So say something like, stay with that feeling, let's notice it more while we listen to this piece of music. And then what you will do is pick a piece of music that is, in your judgment, reflective of the emotion and the experience the person's having, and allow the two of you to sort of sit in silence while the song plays, and they can, kind of be with that experience. That would be an appropriate way to use music. So instead of having a preset playlist, I usually advise people to have done your homework and have a set of music, of different types of music that you feel like you can pull on in moments like this. So having a sophisticated use of music as a tool can be really powerful. Many, many times when we do this, the client will say afterwards that the music really deepened that experience. They're prompted by you to just sit with that experience or deepen into it, and then the music helps that. It almost like it's the evocative nature of the music allows them to stay with that or bathe in that sense or that feeling. Then when the music ends, you would check in with the person, and you may go back to some sort of verbal exchange as appropriate. So that's targeted use of music for the specifics of what is actually coming up verbally in a session. And I do support using music that way. Obviously, this isn't a hard science. There's an art to this. And so this has to do with your skill set, your instincts, and your comfort level with using it in this way. Other providers that I respect will use music on the beginning of a session to set the tone as sort of the onset of the medicine is happening, to sort of signal that we're moving into another space. Or similarly, use it at the end of the session when the medicine's wearing off and we're sort of easing into a state of sobriety, as to sort of open or close the medicine journey. But in between, they are working on content or having a verbal exchange. So that's the second way that I think you could appropriately use music, again, being mindful of the type. And a third way to use music as background. If you are interested in playing music throughout, instead of a curated playlist that has a certain dramatic arc to it, I do work with some providers who I respect and believe that playing background music that is unintrusive, like monotone or vibrational, or example of this is binaural beats tracks that are designed for relaxation or other purposes. So some of my providers that I work closely with will use that throughout the whole session. They will, and their input that they've given to me is that almost becomes part of the container. It's a little bit of a signal to the client on an unconscious level that we're entering in. This is sort of the soundtrack of the altered state, so to speak. But because it's not distracting, the client isn't pulled into the emotional content of the music, It's almost a background, unobtrusive type of sound that you can have a conversation over and on top of. So this is not something I have done as often, but I'm told that this can work really well, and I believe that that does make some sense. So experimenting with playing those kinds of tracks, almost like, you could think of it almost like white noise, but it's a little more evocative. It has a little bit of melody or vibrational quality to it that is relaxing or opening. But it doesn't interrupt your ability to talk over it and have the person track what you're saying and be able to track their own thoughts and what they're thinking. So that could be a third appropriate use of music. And I'll put something up on the screen here with this video referring to like those types of background soundtracks that you might want to experiment with. So we've talked about using music in the beginning or end of a session. We've talked about this potential use of like binaural beats as a background. And then we've talked about using music, my favorite way, in a targeted method that actually amplifies the psychotherapeutic work that they're already doing. Notice that none of those things is the same as just having a pre-curated playlist that you just turn on when they get into the session and you just let it play through. I don't agree with doing that. I think that's a totally acceptable way to do it if you're doing an experiential training session or you're working with someone as a sitter, like I said. You're not doing therapy. But be aware that you, because music can control emotional content of a psychedelic experience so much, you may be actually steering them, right? You're not, so it goes a little bit against the what I've spoken about before as the self-directed or non-directive approach. You can steer someone's experience with music in ways that you may not fully realize. People will often come out and say, well, I was in such and such an experience and then the song shifted and then it took me here, right? So be aware of the power that you have with that if you're creating a playlist for both good and potential bad. So it depends on your goals. What I recommend to those of you who are in training, to trainees who are watching this, is use your own experiential sessions to explore this. Those of you who are in my training program know that I believe therapists should have a lot of experiential sessions. So because you're going to be having a lot of, in this case, ketamine sessions of different types, use those to do your own experimenting with this and draw your own conclusions. Do some sessions with playlists, do some without, with use of more binaural beat soundtracks. Experiment with having your sitter talking to you back and forth and seeing how it feels with music on or with music off, and see what you think. Because there's nothing that I say is going to be as compelling as what your own experience is. I know that from experience when I give this talk that a lot of trainees will say the music is so powerful and it's such a compelling part of the experience and I just really hesitate to take it out. And you're correct on that. But note that because it is so compelling, such a compelling part of the experience, you may not be doing psychotherapy as easily with the music on board. So that's my broader point. So the conclusion here is that the use of music in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is actually a nuanced question. And I think that you can gather that from what I've said so far. And each of you as providers will come to your own sort of place or balance with it. My main recommendation is that you experiment with that and you actually, figure out for yourself what I'm talking about so that you can be informed about what the subjective experience probably is for your clients with all these musical variables. So in general, err on the side of using it less, especially if you have goals with your client around particular content that you need to work on, because you may never get there if the music is sort of distracting the process. So I hope this has been edifying, if it's somewhat discomforting for some, and I'll see you guys in the next video.